Ladies and gentlemen, it is time once again for The Unconventional Pastor, starring, the Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves. This evening, Bob Greaves is going to be discussing the very first sermon of Jesus himself. Stay tuned.
Well, good evening again. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. I every so often I'll take one of the posts that I make on the Unconventional Pastor page on Facebook, and I'll take a post and I'll just have it promoted, and I advertise it. And every time I do that, I get a number of people who respond to it and say, "Wow, this is interesting stuff." But without fail, every time I do that, I also gather a great deal of people coming on. You're a heretic. Oh, this is terrible. Wait, you lie. And I get private messages and things like that. So I've grown rather accustomed to it, I guess. But I find it amazing that we live in a world where there are some people who are very refreshed to find a perspective that isn't quite the usual, and other people who find that when they hear a perspective they don't agree with, it just pushes their buttons. Now today I was actually in something that I rarely do, because I don't like the way people do it when they do. Is you notice, no doubt, that I rarely come to the biblical text itself and start quoting the biblical text and start explaining the biblical text. I rarely do that, mainly because I think that people have had that done so often in a way that I find unacceptable or inappropriate, that I find that sometimes it's difficult to use the biblical text without people hearing from it what we traditionally tend to hear from it. In fact, I really enjoyed the show I was able to do with my good friend Greg, who was on with me just in the previous show for his show, of which he's the host and I'm just the co-host. That he talked about Luke chapter 17. I think it was somewhere on there. Anyway, but the odd thing was that I was hoping he wasn't going to steal too much of my thunder, because I had already decided earlier that I was going to actually talk about Luke chapter 4. So that's odd that we would do that on the same day, but hey, that's the way plans work. Anyhow, also because some of the things that he had to say in response to that topic, and by the way, he picks those topics. I never do. And many times I just find out when I get on the air with him what it is he wants to talk about, what have you. I find it more fun that way. I tend to be, I guess, better when I'm trying to be spontaneous than when I'm necessarily, really prepared ahead of time. Not as prepared, but at the same time, I think it sometimes can work better. So we get the best of both worlds. This one I tend to prepare for a little bit more. But anyway, I was looking at Luke chapter 4, which is that section that Luke talks about just after Jesus has gone through this temptation, where he gets the 3 temptations. And I've actually spoken about that in the past as well. On a previous show, where the gist that I get out of those temptations is not so much that Jesus was tempted to turn a stone into bread, or tempted to jump down from the temple to demonstrate how the angels of God will hold him up, nor is he prepared to bow down so that he can regain all the kingdoms of the world. But that the temptation of Jesus really began with, "If you are the Son of God," and Jesus didn't respond with feeling any need to kind of prove anything. And so Jesus begins his public ministry with a clear sense of having gone through the process of discovering that this isn't about me. It isn't about proving who I am. That's not the point here. And so I don't have to. I don't have to do this or do that so as to prove to people who I am. It's not about the proof. And in fact, in many ways, the kind of agnostic theist that I am, I would even argue that we don't need to have the kind of a faith that we can that we can prove. That would be kind of dangerous, I would think. And people who think they have the kind of a faith they can prove, oftentimes tend to be very dangerous people. Don't we know? They do things like crusades. They do things like witch hunts. They do things like put up signs that say God hates fags and things like that. But anyway, so after this temptation, Jesus heads on over to Nazareth, the place where he had grown up, and on a Sabbath day, while there, he goes into this synagogue there, and he would do that routinely, and he stood up to read that time, and a scroll of the prophet Isaiah was brought to him, and he found a place inside the scroll of Isaiah where it said something. And it's interesting to note what he quoted from Isaiah. In fact, if you read Isaiah where he quoted it, Jesus stops in the middle of the quotation. He doesn't answer it. He doesn't say the whole thing. He just starts the passage. And it went something like this. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And now people who hear him saying this, he's reading from the scroll, and although Jesus spoke Aramaic, chances are he had to say this in Hebrew. So he's not speaking in Aramaic, and people clearly understood that he's reading from their biblical text. Their inspired scripture. Be honest with you, sometimes I find myself lost for words to know how to describe the text the way I understand it, because I don't ascribe to it the kind of authority that most Christians do. Anyhow, so Jesus is reading this text from Isaiah, from the prophet, the prophets, and he then rolls up the scroll, stopping in the middle. Now, this would have no doubt been a familiar phrase, a familiar passage from Isaiah. So it's kind of amazing already that he stopped. It's like telling half the story, and people, So he stops in the middle, rolls up the scroll, and he hands it back to the attendant, and he sits down. And of course, because he stops in the middle and then goes back to sit down after rolling up the scroll, this would have been unusual, to the point where people are kind of watching him as he goes back to his seat to sit down, and they're thinking like, oh, this is awkward. Well, what do we do? And then just before he sits down, or as he's sitting down, Jesus says, today, this writing is fulfilled in your hearing. Now, that itself also would have been quite provocative, and but the people are nonetheless kind of impressed with him. The very fact that they're impressed with him strikes me as being something that indicates that although perhaps it might be thought as being a bit smarmy, perhaps he might be thought as being a little bit put the stick in their eye kind of guy in saying this in the synagogue, not quoting the entire passage, because I'll tell you what, if you look at Isaiah, this is a very nice passage. It begins really nice, but then after the point where Jesus stopped, it starts to go a little bit downhill from there. and it gets a little rougher. And Jesus stops it right there. And of course, there are many people who are counting on it getting rougher because in that day, they're under the oppression of the Roman occupation. And there's various stuff. Life is hard, So people are in many ways looking forward to the day when the vengeance of God takes it out on our enemies and ends all this suffering. So Jesus stopped, in a sense, before the good part, or what might have been thought as the good part, and tells them, "This day it's been fulfilled in your hearing." Now, in some ways, I think this impressed people that Jesus would be this provocative, this apparently different and refreshing, perhaps in some ways, and in some ways, no doubt, curious. What's he up to? What's he doing? What could that be all about? And as this story continues on, that they were amazed at him, and of course they're saying to themselves, "Who is this guy?" And of course they recognize him because he's talking to them in the synagogue at Nazareth. This is a place where he, people knew him, and they go, "That's Joseph's son." Oh, it is. Yeah, it is. And so they're talking to him and just kind of figuring out what it is. And Jesus says to them, he then follows this up by saying to them, privately there, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we have heard you do in Capernaum. And truly I say to you," he continued, he says, and I'm reading this from the NIV, I think, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time." Now listen to what he's going to say here. "I assure you, there were many widows in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to one widow in Zarephath and in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha, the prophet, and yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." Now, there's a sense in which why would Jesus say that? And why would he say that to them, particularly after he had told them that, the day is going to come when you're going to say to me, 'Physician, heal yourself'? Jesus seems to be saying right from the get-go, right after he gave this first reading of the scripture, which in a sense, his first sermon was not, that was the text of the sermon, the section from Isaiah that he read, but his first sermon was really that one sentence: "Today this writing is fulfilled in your hearing." That was the whole sermon right there. So why is he telling them this? He's really saying something, as I understand it, quite provocative, again, being very, but also demonstrating a clarity that he has. He understands what the potential is of what it is he's about to do, where it's going to lead, what the eventual outcome is going to be. And it's going to be one where these people who are kind of impressed with him now are going to find that they've had their fill of him. Not all of them, but many of them. And, particularly those whose interest in Jesus was more along the lines of, well, he seems to be doing all these wonderful, wonderful things. Let's have him do some wonderful things here, and which in a sense is kind of like, speaking to the greed in them instead of the care and concern. Not necessarily all of them, but there's a sense in which that's the problem that I see in this story, regardless of whether we understand it in a manner that's a literal, true, or whatever. That's not the point. But nonetheless, in the story here, we see the problem of somebody who comes along, such as Jesus. When you do the kind of good he can do, it doesn't have the kind of response that is good for people to have. There's almost a sense in which we'd be better off if he really didn't do it, because for the most part, people are going to have to depend upon themselves. seems to be that's the way life really works. And so when Jesus is then speaking to them, he talks to them about this. He's saying, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And then he says, which in a sense is a way of his, without asserting it, implying that he will be regarded by them as a prophet, and it's not going to go well. But he points out some real problems that they didn't think of as problems. And there's a sense here in which it's almost like Jesus is giving a Richard Dawkins speech. I just read to you a text that you consider your sacred text, and I didn't read the whole thing the way you may have wanted me to. And you're going to have this way of thinking of me as somebody wonderful, and things are going to amaze you right now. But, this is not, there's going to come a day when the honeymoon is over. And I'll tell you why, in a sense. You've got this religion, you have this faith about Yahweh. And I need to tell you something. This Yahweh doesn't seem to be the kind of God who really cares about you. He seems to be more about, some of these isolated moments of keeping you teased. It's kind of like the carrot leading you on. And, and that's all he's doing. That and nothing more. He's not really, he's kind of like the absentee landlord. He's not really doing the things that you claim that he's supposed to be doing or that he has done. And when he does these things you claim he does, he seems to only do it for such a small select few that the rest of everybody else suffers. Now, the NIV goes on to say that the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. And so because they were furious, I think that is the reason why I interpret this and understand this to be that Richard Dawkins speech. Because if Jesus was saying something that was merely retelling a text from, story from the text, and if he was actually just reaffirming it, they wouldn't be furious. So Jesus is actually taking this other text. He's taken one text, quoted the first half of it, and refused to complete that text to say the things that followed. That was an interesting violation, number one. And now he's pointing out to them other things that exist in their text that he says in a manner where they get it very clearly, the message he's telling them. Excuse me. I don't really think an awful lot about this. This God of yours doesn't sound like a very nice guy to me. And when Jesus draws this implication, and he draws it without actually coming out and saying it. It's like he talks about it and then kind of looks at them perhaps. I don't know exactly what he does. But whatever it is, however he said it, whether it's through tone of voice or through gestures or whatever, when they hear this, they get the point he's making. And they're furious. They're not happy with this. They actually decide to, it's time to get rid of this guy. And according to Luke, what they do here is they drive him out of the town, and they want to take him to some hilltop with a cliff on it so they can throw him over. But he manages to somehow just kind of slip away and slip through them in a way where he gets away. Now, this is one of the reasons why I have been one of these people who interpret Jesus as walking this thin line. He is not trying to be absolutely clear at first because he wants to create a great number of provocative questions during the 3 years that he's going to be able to do this before he finally has asked too many provocative questions. And the actual traditional religionists are saying, we got to get rid of this guy. When they begin to conspire a way of having him killed and killed by legal means, make sure that it's done through apparently due process, the trumped up charges, the requirement that Rome, crucify him and really get rid of him, show this guy exactly what it is we think of him. We don't like the way he's messing with our religion. But I interpret this as Jesus being this person who comes. I don't believe that Jesus comes as their Messiah. I believe that Jesus comes instead of their Messiah and says, I am the Messiah that you need, not the Messiah you were expecting, or not the Messiah you even wanted. And he comes out provocatively right from the very start, getting ready to make it something else. I got oh, by the way, I have a message here. Let's see, that was actually from yesterday. So that was from somebody else. So I'm not going to worry about that one. I did get a message here from someone. Joey, if you did send me a message, send it again, because I got other messages that came in from Skype. But anyhow, so here we are. We're looking at Jesus' introduction to the world, as it were, beginning with, first of all, this private temptation that involves him deciding that who he is not the issue, and yet who these people say Yahweh is, that is an issue. And he's prepared to turn that into an issue. And he's prepared to confront that. And as I understand it, Jesus comes at this opportunity to speak, even going to his own hometown, where people know him, where for him to actually try and pull this off there is, in a sense, a combination of the people who are not likely to respect him and the people who are not likely to kill him yet, hopefully. They say, as Jesus says, no prophet is respected in his own hometown. There are many definitions of the word expert, and some definitions of the word expert begin. An expert is somebody who knows something and is more than 50 miles away from home. It's like, you don't think of the people that that you're commonly seeing as experts, as people whose clout and authority and credibility and insight and wisdom is of an expert level. If it's your next door neighbor, or if it's somebody who lives here. I live in Binghamton, New York. You have to bring people in from Syracuse or Rochester or New York if you want experts. You can't find experts in Binghamton if you live in Binghamton, But then, if you live in Rochester, you can't get anybody from Rochester. You got to get somebody from Binghamton, There's that kind of mentality, and I suppose that's a very common social attitude in various cultures. Part of the reason why perhaps Jesus talks about, truly I tell you, no prophet is respected in his own, accepted in his own hometown. But as I look at this text, here is where I am beginning to understand the perspective that I have of Jesus. Later, Jesus is quoted as saying, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." And Jesus comes to reveal, so it says, who God really is, in distinction from who people have been thinking that God is. So that comes to the point of what people then might want to ask, particularly people who listen to this program, who know that I'm a believer, many of them being atheists. I see that Jesus is translated and often interpreted as trying to give to us a very clear picture of God. But the truth is, I believe that Jesus defines God more in terms of who he can't be, who he isn't. I think that Jesus tends to define God more in terms of the unknown, more in terms of the fact that God isn't who you think he is. And who you think he is, that's not God. That's a brute. That's a person who doesn't care about you. That is a view that is just oppressive and abusive. And he comes here instead to well, as he said there, as he quoted that, he's come to bring good news to the poor. He's sent to proclaim freedom for prisoners. Now think about it. Who are the poor that Jesus is then talking about as he quotes that text? I got to be honest with you. I get the impression that by the time this entire incident is done, Jesus is saying, those of you who believe in Yahweh, you know, this is poor. You know, this is a poverty of spirituality, and I got good news for you though. And and who is it that Jesus is talking about as prisoners, and that he's come to bring them freedom? Jesus is talking about these people here who are tethered to this text. Jesus talks about giving sight to the blind. And by implication, even by having stopped there and telling them this scripture is filled in your hearing, he's saying, you're the poor, you're the prisoners, you're the blind. And yet he says, I'm here to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What a provocative, out of left field approach this is. You know, regardless of who you may think Jesus is, this is an amazingly ingenious way of starting it all. Very provocative. People are going to pay attention to this. This is something very different. But this is also something that is begging people to figure out what's going on here. And it's also something, because it is so countercultural, this is either going to lead to something amazing, or it's going to end not well. And of course, I think we know according to the story that this part of it does end in a manner we could probably consider as not well. The trumped up charges that end up leaving Jesus murdered. So these people, they're the poor, they are the prisoners, they are the blind. And what do we have? We have these poor, blind prisoners tethered to this God who shows up every so often, as it were, according to the way they even stated. And, of all the people who could use the help, just this person and that person, just this person and that person. Now, this presents a real serious problem in the way that it's understood. And I see this even as a problem in Jesus' own life. I get the impression when I read the gospel stories that even if the gospel writers themselves don't even clearly see it, they reveal enough to us to show us that I think Jesus was very uncomfortable with this conundrum and didn't even really know necessarily how to work with it or how to deal with it. That's at least the impression I get. Kind of reminds me of a joke I heard once. Should I share it? This is a joke that my father told me, and it was a joke that when my father told me, I thought it was very, very funny. But the thing is this: when I knew the circumstances under which he first heard the joke, I realized my dad didn't get the joke, even though he thought it was funny. And it was basically a joke of it takes place in the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, they capture a priest, a politician, and an engineer. Now, I'll tell you now, my dad was an engineer. He was one of these people who designs things and understands things and determines the parameters, and he did a lot of what we would call stress analysis of metals, and was he's just one of these brainy guys. Kind of today we might call him a geek. But instead of being a computer geek, he was a physics geek, and dealing with the all of the issues of this the science of chemistry and physics, particularly in dealing with metals. Anyway, so there's this cleric, a pastor, I guess, or bishop or whatever, a politician, and an engineer. So then what they do is they bring the preacher up, and they tell him, well, look, for crimes against everybody, we're just going to bring you to the guillotine here. And so we're going to give you some choices, though. We can either put a bag over your head so that you can't see it, and when you lay down on the guillotine, a bed, you can either go face up or face down. And the preacher thinks to himself, my heart is clean before God. I am sincere. I have nothing to be ashamed of. I don't want the bag on my head. And I will lie down on the guillotine, face up, looking towards heaven. And so he lies down on there, and they ask him if he has any last words, and he lifts his hand up toward heaven, and he says, I have been a good and faithful servant, and God knows my heart, and all this. And when they've heard enough of this stuff, they just pull the cord, and down comes the blade, and it stops about an inch from his neck. And they're all kind of amazed, and they're looking at it, and they don't see anything wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with the guillotine, and so they don't know. They figure this must be an act of God, and he's delivered this man alive, and so they decide to pardon him right there on the spot, and they lift up the blade and they let the guy go, and the preacher goes off, and he's done well. And then the next one they bring up is a politician, and as a politician, he's not about ready to be kind of outdone by that spectacular appearance, and so he says, "Well, I shall go without the bag, and I will, lie face up, and I'm a servant of the people and all that." And so they lay him down there, and he's looking face up, and they ask him if he has any last words as he's laying there on the guillotine, and he raises his hand up towards heaven, and he's pointing up, and he says, "I have been a servant of the people. I am a good man. I have been the reason why you people have it so well off," and all this. And when they'd heard enough of this, they pulled the cord. And then again with this guy, the blade stops like an inch in front of his throat. And they're really looking over the guillotine, trying to figure out, well, what's wrong with it? What's going on here? And they can't find anything wrong with the guillotine. And so they're worried about it, but they realize, kind of already set a precedent here. And so they decide they kind of really have to pardon this politician, and they do. And so he walks off victorious and feeling rather good about the way that worked out. Well, then it's the engineer's turn, and the engineer is brought up to the guillotine, and he's thinking to himself, well, the odds are, and it's going to, I think my chances are best if I go without the hat, and that I go face up. I think that's what I'll do. He's looking at the odds, and he's calculating the probabilities, and so that's what he's going to do. And so they put him down on the guillotine bed, and he's there, and of course, face up and looking up, and they ask him if he has any last words. And so, what he does is he too, like the other two in front of him, he points up towards heaven, and he's pointing up there, and he goes, "I think I see the problem." Now, see, that's the joke, because this engineer, he is so into engineering that when he's standing there watching the preacher almost get killed, he's standing there watching the politician almost get killed, but the guillotine doesn't work. And so what is the engineer doing there? Instead of fearing for his life and for what's about to happen and watching this happen twice before him, he's wondering, oh, I wonder what's wrong with the machinery. Why is it not working? And so when he finally lies down, instead of thinking, well, this is it, this is the end of my life, he's actually, examining the guillotine from this angle to see if he might be able to notice something. And when he notices it, he says, "Oh, I think I see the problem." And the truth is, if he cared about his life more than figuring out problems, he would wait until they had pardoned him. But by seeing the problem, he's probably, oh, okay, let's fix that. And then off with his head. So, but anyway, the person who told that joke to my dad, was actually talking to my dad about the fact that he was one of these engineer types who doesn't really pay attention to the world around him and what's going on, because he's just too much of an engineer. And it also, as I found out later, was a joke that was told to him in the context of his struggles in being an attentive father. And my dad thought the joke was just terribly funny, and when he shared it with me, it was just a terribly funny thing. And but I realized, he didn't get the joke because he never stopped being that engineer. It looks like we do have. I'm getting. Let's see if I can find it here. I'm getting notices that there is a. Okay, maybe I can find it now. Okay, viewer comment sounds almost like A Marcionette view. Jesus was there to save people from the Old Testament God. I totally agree. That is exactly what, and I don't think that Jesus could have gotten away with it by just coming out and saying, okay, hey folks, I'm here. I'm here to begin a ministry, and I want you to know that I'm going to lay my cards out on the table. I can't stand Yahweh. We're going to get rid of this guy. We're going to destroy religion. I don't think that he could have done it. I think that Jesus came deliberately in a manner where they don't know. Is he with us? Is he against us? Is he the Messiah, or is he a heretic? And I think he intended to maintain that confusion until he had done enough work to demonstrate to them that he was no friend of Yahweh. And yet, he claimed to be a representative of God to show them who God is. So yeah, that's pretty much the way that I would put that into perspective. Definitely, that Jesus came to save us, as it were, from the Old Testament God. And he has to do this in a way where he's going to be. He has to decide what his priorities are. His priorities are not to try to make the issue who he is. Now, this brings me back to also other things that people have asked me. So, Bob, you're a theist. You believe in God. Do you think that Jesus was God? What does it mean for him to be God? And the answer to that question for me is this: I don't know, and I don't care. It's possible, but even if he is or isn't, I don't see that in terms of Jesus' concerns as the issue. He does say, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because, he has anointed me to proclaim the good news. When Peter finally gets around saying, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. But then again, Jesus said, have you not read ye are gods? So is Jesus really saying he's any different than us? I don't know. I don't know. I don't care either. I don't think that's the point. I think that the point in many ways of this ministry that he has is for us to walk away from all this religion, is to walk away from all of this dogma, is to walk away from all of these things that enslave us, that imprison us, that keep us blind, that make us poor. I think that that's part of what Jesus was dealing with. There's almost as if Jesus is saying, I am the Son of God, and I have a message from God. He wants you all to be secular humanists. So please, can we just get on with it? There is a sense here in which Jesus is trying to, it's almost as if you got it all wrong, And I think that there's something very unusual going on here. And I think that's also an extremely difficult message to make clear. And I don't know that one could make that message clear in simply one generation. And in fact, I would say that I think that that Jesus was such an astoundingly influential person in what happened, that that when he is murdered and then apparently resurrected, I have no real interest in trying to prove or declare or assert that Jesus was actually resurrected, but I do think it is important to recognize that these people definitely believed that he was. Now, I have no problem believing that he was. I have no problem believing that maybe that he wasn't, whatever. But for these people who really believed that he was, this was radical as well. And I think that they eventually turned this belief into Jesus. This belief in Jesus into just another religion that was just, Yahweh 2.0, which I think that eventually what develops into the Roman church and then eventually the Protestant church is just this same old crap that makes us poor, prisoners, and blind. And I think that this is really counterproductive and contrary to what it was that Jesus came to do. And it's unfortunate because it basically undoes all the progress that could have been made. And let's see, we might have another viewer comment. That's a problem for those who are so micro-analytical. Perhaps it is. I'm not sure what, don't tell me, don't tell me he tells them how to fix it. viewer comment says here. You know what? I don't think we need to know necessarily how to fix it. I think I think that human beings really are amazing things. I believe in us. I believe in our abilities. I believe in our capacity. And I really think that what's going to happen here is that if we can walk away from oppressive religion, if we can walk away from dogmatic religion, if we can walk away from the concept of a God that requires of us to even know who that God is, if we can walk away from the concept of a God where there's any concept that this God requires you to think this way or think that way, or else there are dire consequences. If we can walk away from that notion of God, we're going to do just fine. And you know, the notion of God that I have is one where I can't understand or conceive of the God that I believe in as possessing any of these requirements. It's not necessary that it be about him. It's not necessary that you figure it out. It's not even necessary that you have a sense of his presence. This is your life. This is our culture. We are the people. We're here. Let's do what we can do. Let's be the people we are. This isn't that kind of thing. You know, God isn't that kind of God. It hadn't meant to be that way. It brings me back to the other questions. Anyway, that's a problem for those who are so my granted. The viewer was talking about the engineer fixing it. Yeah, I got you now. Microanalytical. Yeah, that engineer had some serious problems. And true story. The guy who told my dad that joke was Albert Einstein. They knew each other, and that was the joke that. In fact, that's the way my dad told me. He says, "What?" We were talking about something one day. He says, "Well, it reminds me of a joke that Albert Einstein told me," and then he told me about that. But you know, the thing here though with Jesus is he is speaking to us in a way that is provocative, and I really get the impression that the eventual crucifixion that he faced was because the people who were particularly ready to lose power because Jesus was getting too popular, Jesus was getting too effective, too many people were listening to what he had to say, and they knew what his message was. They had to get rid of the guy. I really think that today we happen to be, fortunately, a bit more civilized. The human race has kind of grown up some since then. We've discovered a few things. We actually came into the scientific age, which in a manner of speaking, it's in its own sense kind of threatened the authority of the church, which I think caused the church to become actually even far more dogmatic. It was jealous of the authority and credibility that a certainty of dogma seem to possess. That's why, although I am a theist, although I do believe in God, I can't believe in the dogma. I can't believe that could ever be essential. I can't even conceive of a God who would make that essential or necessary. You know, it just doesn't work for me. Even though the truth is, as a person who has this ongoing, continuous sense of the presence of God, I don't know really what else to do with that sense of that presence, but to notice it. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. You might start to notice, and what do I make of that? I don't know, but I've actually come to the point where I feel that there's nothing that I can not make of it or make of it, and that it's for me an irresolvable conundrum, which is why I call myself an agnostic theist. I certainly believe in God, but I also recognize that this is not operating on any axis of actual knowledge or any axis of anything compelling or of anything like that. It is simply a conclusion I am comfortable making. And I really see this as part of what Jesus was aiming at when he came to give us some better news than the news we've been living under, to express to us what freedom from this kind of enslaving religion is really all about. to help us to begin to just open our eyes and stop being so blind, because we have these blinders on that keep us behaving in a manner that's merely obedient to our God and obedient to his commandments. And meanwhile, we've been given an opportunity to have a life, and what do? We don't live it. We're too busy doing the will of somebody else, as it were, And so this freedom that we've been given, this value and richness that we have, this vision and sight that we have, is something that is part of what it really means to this is the Lord's favor, as I understand it. Let's see, we have for a minute I thought I saw another comment pop up, but I didn't. Anyhow, don't have much more to say tonight about this, but other than to say that let me finish with this way of thinking. I am a theist, but I'm one of those theists who I really don't care if you're a theist. You don't need to be. I'm not worried about it. I don't think God's worried about it. I think that given the fact that, in fact, sometime I'll talk about it maybe again, I believe that it is impossible to prove God. I think it's impossible to disprove God. And I think that we live in a world where that's so, because it just isn't an important issue. It can't be how we can't revolve our lives around a dogma. It is a useless prison. It is a useless poverty. It is a useless blindness, and we don't need it. And I really see Jesus as a person who came to make this so, and he made a mockery of that religion, even by becoming something of a sacrifice, as a way, in a sense, of violating the notion of sacrifice, because he wasn't a sacrifice. He was murdered. It was a conspiracy that put him to death. And as Paul had even said, if people had understand who this was among them, they never would have crucified him. They wouldn't have done it. It wasn't necessary. Jesus didn't die for you because God needed anything about this. You know what? In the sense in which Jesus died for our sin, because we'd rather be poor prisoners and blind. And that's just not good, Nobody needs to die. There's no need for doing all this other stuff. I really see this as the method, the madness, and the ministry of Jesus. And so there we go. Anyway, thank you for listening tonight. I appreciate it. My name is Bob Greaves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor, and that's just some of my musings about this text. Good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned in just a moment right here on the Florida NCG studio stage. We will be having Dr. Jones and Rhonda Jones and panelists, but most importantly, special guest David Hayward, a.k.a. the Naked Pastor. It's too bad. I don't know if Bob is going to be joining us tonight. I don't think he will be, but it would be so wonderful to have the Naked Pastor together with the Unconventional Pastor, and then they could fight. I think that would be amazing. What do you think? Oh, well. Anyways, David Hayward is going to be joining us, and we're going to be looking at some of his fantastic single-panel comic strips and commenting on them, getting his views, and it's going to be a great discussion, so don't go away.